IBESS, Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Part 8, will examine the inputs and outputs of materials and energy efficiency of two named agricultural systems. The essential idea is the supply of food is inequitably available, and land suitable for food production is unevenly distributed among societies, and this can lead to conflict and concerns. Here is the first of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie can be found on the next slide. Here is the second of two slides that outline the available movies in the Soil and Terrestrial Food Production Unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is right here. Here is the IB syllabus statement that carries us through this movie. Compare and contrast the system characteristics for two named food production systems, including the inputs and outputs, system characteristics, environmental impact, and socio-economic factors. An agricultural system has the purpose of maximizing the production, the output, while reducing the inputs. The inputs to an agricultural system will vary depending on whether the farm is typical of an MEDC or an LEDC. But generally, the inputs would include sunlight, water, soil or land, labor, seed. Inputs might, depending on the farm type, also include fossil fuels, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. Now, outputs generally would include heat, the agricultural crop itself, waste from the crop, stock or say bones, manure to be used on the field as an input, or seeds to be used to start the system next season. Here is a slide that shows a comparison of inputs as well as system characteristics among different agricultural types. I will compare the modern industrial farm, typical of a wheat or corn farm in Iowa, with the traditional farm, typical of a subsistence rice farm, say in Nepal or India. Now notice the difference in required land and labor. Modern industrial farms require lots and lots of land and do not require much labor. Traditional intensive farms require a lot less land but require far more labor. Now, the fossil fuel requirement of the modern industrial farm is very high, while the requirement for the traditional intensive farm is far less. Before leaving this slide, refresh yourself with the shifting cultivation approach seen here, an approach you might remember as slash and burn. Why would the land requirement be high while the labor requirement low? And notice, no requirement for fossil fuel. Now remember the general descriptions of various agricultural types that I've covered in a previous movie. These descriptions provide some information on system characteristics. The subsistence or traditional agricultural system produces food for the use of the family or a local community. It's for local consumption with traditional methods. The commercial or industrial agricultural system is a large-scale effort to maximize yields for profit, possibly for export, using commercial methods. In addition to inputs and outputs, we need to consider the energy efficiency of different agricultural systems. In energy units, efficiency is defined as output divided by input times 100. On the fields in both images, we can see the outputs in the form of a crop to be harvested. The lower image would appear to have less output per unit area, thus you might predict that the farm in the lower image would be less efficient. But efficiency is a ratio of output to input. The farm in the upper image might have more output per unit area, but consider the high inputs when thinking about efficiency. Now, efficiency is maximized if output is high with a low input. Now, if the inputs to an agricultural system are high, efficiency might be low no matter how productive a farm is. Now, productivity and efficiency are distinct, different terms. Be careful, be thoughtful. So let's start with some system characteristics of the industrial commercial farm, typical of a wheat or corn farm in the U.S., say in Iowa. This is a monoculture of low diversity. Hybrid seeds or genetically engineered seeds would be used, and this image hints at all of the other inputs, and there are lots. So let's get the fundamentals out on the table right away. The industrial commercial farm system has low diversity. It's a monoculture. It has lower sustainability. It has introduced crop species. And the socio-economic factors are production for profit, production for export, high quantity, quality is questionable, and it's less sustainable. First, consider the habitat that's lost to serve the need of industrial agriculture. The modern industrial farm, typical of a wheat or corn farm in Iowa, has high productivity, that's an output, but its inputs are also high, thus low efficiency. That's right, high productivity, but low efficiency. And this type of agriculture is not sustainable in the long term. Here's a look at all of the inputs: hybrid seeds, irrigation water, fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides. In energy terms, these inputs add up to be large. And this type of agriculture is not sustainable. Maybe you can see why in some of these images. Irrigation water is a typical input on an industrial or commercial farm. Evaluate the sustainability of the water source. Surface water is renewable, but deep groundwater much less so. Hybrid seeds or genetically engineered seeds are typical inputs to the industrial farm. Genetically engineered seeds might produce plants resistant to insects, or plants that contain extra vitamins, or plants that are resistant to frost or resistant to soil salinization. Industrial farms have huge fertilizer or insecticide herbicide inputs. These added chemicals reduce the sustainability of the farm. You should understand that. Industrial farms often grow non-native species. Industrial farms are monocultures, low diversity. Low diversity farms are not resilient if disturbed. Industrial farms have a reduced sustainability relative to traditional farms. The modern industrial farm uses intensive machinery to till the soil, to sow the seeds, to increase planting density, to spread fertilizers, to harvest the crop. Machines increase the magnitude of the inputs, and due to soil damage, this type of agriculture is not sustainable in the long run, not to mention the added pollution when burning fossil fuels. Livestock growth promoters, such as hormones, are also inputs. Hormones increase the net production of farm animals, more mass per unit time per area. This is exactly what an industrial farm is all about. Are hormones getting into the human food supply? Livestock growth promoters, such as antibiotics, are inputs. Antibiotics allow animals to grow in high densities where the spread of disease would otherwise limit secondary production. Industrial farms use high-density animal populations to increase secondary productivity. Is this sustainable? Remember that industrial farms are monocultures of low diversity, enhanced by the purchase of hybrid or genetically engineered seed and the spraying of pesticides and herbicides. Industrial farms are not very sustainable. Soil could be considered an input to any farm system, as it is a requirement for producer crops. Soil quality varies widely and may influence the need for certain inputs like fertilizers, depending on the quality of the soil. Remember, the quality of soil influences the primary productivity of an area. Let's move to outputs. The output of the modern industrial farm is the part of the crop of interest to humans, the wheat grain, by way of example. If the industrial farm includes any animals, milk could be an output. Are there added hormones in the milk? If the industrial farm includes any animals, meat could be the output. Industrial farms focus on mass production for profit, often for export. Industrial commercial farms focus on mass production, profit. For a moment, consider food quantity and quality. Is the high production food of industrial farms of high quality? Is the high production food of industrial farms of high quality? That's my question. This image is a high production industrial henhouse. Now I'd like you to think about the inputs that become pollutants as outputs. Consider the scale of erosion on the industrial farm. Wind and water result in soil degradation. Consider the loss of diversity when large areas are cut for the purposes of putting in an industrial farm. Deforestation makes erosion more likely. Consider the sustainability of the industrial farm. If the land is overused, then desertification will occur. Consider the negative environmental impacts of very high-density livestock farming: disease, smells, manure directed to local waterways that results in eutrophication. Industrial farms tend not to use the manure of animals, since manure is a potential output. Not using manure reduces the efficiency of the farm. The packaging, processing, and transportation of food results in pollution through industrial methods that burn fossil fuels. Think about all the plastic that wraps the food in more economically developed countries, MEDCs. The modern industrial farm has relatively low efficiency because although the outputs are high, the inputs are relatively higher. So let's turn our attention to the traditional subsistence farm. On the traditional intensive rice farm of Nepal or India, the land required is less, but the human labor required is quite high, as you can see in this image. Subsistence farming is the production of food to generate the minimum income needed to live. Subsistence farming grows food for local consumption. The traditional farm system has the following characteristics. It's of higher diversity, often a polyculture, higher sustainability, indigenous crop species, and the traditional farm has the following socio-economic factors. It's subsistence production for local consumption, not export, lower quantity, but maybe higher quality, and certainly more sustainable. Traditional farms are not monocultures. Traditional farms tend to be polycultures, more diverse mixtures of plants. Polycultures have the diversity to resist disturbances to the system. Thus, polycultures are more sustainable. Here is an image of a polyculture where rice plants are grown in a rice paddy that includes fish. On traditional farms that raise animals, the density of animals is considerably lower than on the industrial commercial farm. Traditional farms rely not on irrigation water, but instead on rainwater as the input. That traditional farms do not rely on irrigation water drawn from underground aquifers makes traditional farms more sustainable. Irrigation is limited on the traditional intensive farm, and it's not groundwater pumped to the surface by combustion engine pumps. And what irrigation does exist on the traditional farm exists by way of gravity flow. On the traditional intensive rice farm of Nepal or India, the seed is not a hybrid seed, but instead was saved seed from last year's crop, and the seed would not be spread by machine. Traditional subsistence farms often use indigenous seeds or a wild breeding stock. Fertilizers might be used on the traditional farm, but as an input, fertilizer use would be less than that of the modern industrial farm, and fertilizers would be spread by hand. As well, traditional farms use organic animal manure rather than the inorganic chemical fertilizer. Organic animal manure is the fertilizer of choice on traditional farms. Pesticides or herbicides might be used on the traditional intensive rice farm of India or Nepal, but as an input, pesticide-herbicide use would be less than that of the modern industrial farm. Pesticides and herbicides are expensive to buy. On the traditional farm, pesticides would be spread by hand. The traditional farm might use natural biological controls to limit insect pests instead of using insecticides. And on the traditional farm, seeds or seedlings are planted by hand, not by machine. Thus, traditional farms require a high input of physical labor, but also result in less pollution because there are fewer vehicles working the land. Animal labor might also be an input on the traditional farm, less so on the industrial farm. Now be careful as you read this slide, because what you haven't seen among the inputs in traditional agriculture are the high use of machines, high use of fertilizers, high use of herbicides and pesticides, hybrid or genetically engineered seeds. While the traditional intensive farm might be a monoculture, there's more diversity on the traditional farm due to the fewer pesticides and herbicides, if nothing else. Just as with the modern industrial farm, grain is an output on the traditional intensive farm. Here, these women are collectively separating the grain from the stem of the plant, separating the grain from the chaff. Industrial farms do not use the chaff, the stalks, or anything left over once the grain has been taken, but traditional farms might use the stalks to feed animals or heat the house, or use those stalks as roofing material, as you can see in this image. Due to the more diverse polyculture on traditional farms, many crops might be harvested from the farm. In this image, we can see women carrying flowers or leafy crops. Certainly on traditional intensive farms, far more of the plant is utilized than on modern industrial farms. So as we wind this movie down, remember that milk might also be an output on traditional farms, such as those in Nepal or India. Meat and manure, in addition to stalks, are important outputs. On the traditional intensive farm, the outputs are not as high as they are on the modern industrial farm, but the inputs are far lower, thus the efficiency can be higher. Here is a table comparing the productivity, kilograms per area per time, of agricultural systems, some using high energy inputs and others with low energy inputs. Now, with respect to rice, Japan productivity is far higher per hectare than in Bangladesh, and the Netherlands produces far more wheat than Argentina. Now remember, productivity is good, productivity is food, but what did it take to achieve high productivity? What are those high inputs that result in high productivity? Regardless of the size of the output, high inputs will lower efficiency. Now here is a bar graph showing the kilocalories of fossil fuel input to kilocalories of food output as a ratio. Now this ratio is the opposite of efficiency. So those food types seen here with large bars are highly inefficient systems. Feedlot beef is energetically inefficient farming, while vegetable farming is far more efficient. Now think carefully about trophic level efficiency. This should be very clear to you at this point in this course, and if not, see your teacher immediately. I've come back to this slide just to reinforce the fundamental inputs of different agricultural systems. Throughout this movie, I've compared the system characteristics and energy efficiency of two agricultural systems, the modern industrial wheat farm of Iowa and the traditional intensive rice farm of Nepal or India. I've not discussed the economics of farming, though needless to say, if a farmer spends more on inputs than he or she receives from selling the outputs, the farm will not last long. And that brings us to the end of IBESS, Soil and Terrestrial Food Production, Part 8.